I still remember the first time I stepped into her shop. It was tucked neatly between a bakery and a bookstore, a quiet little tailor's corner that seemed to belong to another time. The wooden door creaked when I pushed it open, and the faint chime of the bell above announced my arrival. Inside, everything smelled faintly of pressed linen and freshly brewed tea. Rolls of fabric leaned against the walls in tidy stacks, and sunlight spilled through the tall window, catching specks of dust that drifted lazily in the air. It felt warm, safe, like I had entered someone's home rather than a shop. And then I saw her. She stood behind the counter, carefully folding a length of navy fabric, her movements calm and precise. She was my friend's mother, someone I'd seen in passing before at their house, but here, in her own space, she seemed different. There was a quiet confidence in the way she held herself, shoulders straight, her presence filling the small room with ease. When she lifted her head and noticed me, her eyes softened instantly. "Oh," she said with a smile that carried both grace and kindness, "you must be here for the fitting." Her voice was gentle but assured, the kind that immediately set me at ease, even though my heart had started to thump harder than usual. I nodded quickly, trying not to look too nervous. She came around the counter, wiping her hands on a measuring cloth. Up close, I noticed the faint scent of lavender clinging to her, subtle, not overpowering. The kind of scent that lingers in memory long after. Her hair was tied up neatly, though a loose strand brushed against her cheek, catching the light. "Stand here," she instructed softly, guiding me toward a tall mirror. Her hand touched my arm just briefly, only to adjust my position, but the warmth of her fingertips lingered. I told myself it was nothing, just part of her work, but still, I couldn't help the awareness that spread through me. She studied me in the mirror, tilting her head slightly. "You have your father's shoulders," she murmured, almost to herself. Then, with a small smile, she added, "but your posture gives you away. You're still learning how to carry yourself like a man." Her words caught me off guard, not insulting, not teasing, but observant in a way that felt personal. My throat tightened a little. I wanted to respond, but all I managed was a quiet laugh. She picked up her measuring tape and stepped closer. "Don't worry," she said. "That's what good clothes are for. They don't just cover you. They teach you how to stand." As she worked, sliding the tape across my shoulders and around my chest, I tried to focus on steadying my breath. The shop was quiet except for the soft rustle of fabric and the scratch of her pencil as she noted numbers on a pad. Every now and then, her hand would brush against me, the side of my neck, the curve of my arm, small, fleeting touches that carried no intention other than precision. And yet, each one seemed to reach deeper than skin, leaving behind an impression I couldn't explain. By the time she finished the first set of measurements, I wasn't just thinking about the suit. I was thinking about her. The following day, I returned for the second stage of the fitting. The shop looked just as it had before, warm light spilling through the window, fabric stacked neatly like patient secrets waiting to be revealed. But this time, walking in, I carried something different with me, a restless awareness I couldn't quite name. She greeted me with that same calm smile, but her eyes lingered on me a second longer than before, as though she were quietly taking my measure even before lifting the tape. "You're right on time," she said softly, and somehow that simple approval made me stand a little taller. She motioned me toward the mirror again. I removed my jacket, draping it across the chair, and stood where she asked. The air seemed heavier today, though nothing had changed, same rolls of fabric, same faint fragrance of lavender and tea. It wasn't the room that was different. It was the space between us. She circled me slowly, her measuring tape in hand. First, across the shoulders. Then, around the waist. Her fingers brushed lightly against my side as she tugged the tape snug. I tried to keep my expression neutral, but inside, my pulse had quickened. And then, halfway through, she paused. Her voice came low, thoughtful. "I'll need to measure more than just your size." I blinked, caught off guard. "What do you mean?" I asked, though I already felt the double edge of her words. She smiled faintly, not lifting her eyes from the tape in her hands. "Clothes aren't only about numbers. They're about the person inside them. How he moves. How he carries himself. How he wants to be seen." She looked up then, and for a heartbeat our eyes met in the reflection. Something unspoken flickered there, not unkind, not improper, but undeniably charged. I swallowed hard, unable to find words. She moved on, crouching slightly to mark the length of the trousers. The quiet rustle of fabric filled the room. I stood as still as I could, but every small shift made me acutely aware of how close she was, the warmth of her presence, the faint brush of her hand against my leg as she pinned the fabric. When she leaned in to check the inseam, her breath stirred against the fabric of my shirt. I felt heat rise to my face, though she remained utterly composed, professional. And yet, when she glanced up, her eyes lingered just a second too long before she returned to her task. I tried to focus on the mirror instead, watching myself stand there like a mannequin, but what I saw wasn't just a boy being fitted for a suit. It was someone being studied, weighed, considered, not only in size, but in spirit. When she finally straightened, she gave a small nod, jotting down the numbers in her notebook. "Good," she said quietly. "Now I know what I'm working with." Her words should have sounded ordinary. But instead, they echoed inside me, leaving me to wonder if she had been talking about the suit, or about me. The fitting ended sooner than I expected, but instead of rushing me out the door, she set her measuring tape aside and said gently, "Stay a while. I've just brewed some tea." There was something about the way she said it, not as a polite offer, but as though she genuinely wanted company. I hesitated for a second, then nodded, following her through a narrow archway into the back of the shop. The room was small but cozy, with a single wooden table tucked against the wall, its surface scattered with scraps of fabric and spools of thread. A teapot sat steaming on a tray, and 2 porcelain cups waited beside it. She poured carefully, her hands steady, her movements carrying the same quiet grace I'd noticed when she worked with fabric. "Here," she said, sliding a cup toward me. The steam curled upward, fogging my glasses for a moment, and I had to laugh softly as I wiped them clean. She chuckled too, her laughter low and warm, and for a moment the air felt lighter. We sat across from each other, sipping in the comfortable silence that only 2 people at ease can share. Then, as if something in her softened, she began to talk. She told me about the shop, how it had belonged to her mother before her, how she had learned to stitch before she could even write her name. "Needles and thread were always safer than words," she said with a wistful smile, tracing the rim of her cup. Her voice grew quieter when she spoke of her personal life. She mentioned her son, my friend, with pride, but then her eyes flickered with something deeper. "It's just been the 2 of us for a long time now," she admitted. "After his father left, the shop became more than just work. It became my anchor." The way she said it, so calm yet so vulnerable, caught me off guard. She wasn't asking for pity. She wasn't dramatizing. She was simply sharing a piece of herself. And in that moment, I realized how rarely someone might get to see this side of her. I found myself leaning forward, elbows resting lightly on the table. "You've done a lot," I said quietly. "More than most people could handle." Her eyes met mine, and for just a breath, there was no tailor, no customer, just 2 people, bridging a gap in age and circumstance, speaking honestly. She smiled faintly, but her hand, almost unconsciously, reached across the table and brushed against my wrist. The touch lasted barely a second, but it sent a warmth rushing through me. My skin tingled where her fingers had been. She pulled her hand back, clearing her throat, as if suddenly aware of the intimacy in the gesture. But the moment had already imprinted itself between us. We finished our tea slowly, the silence no longer just comfortable, but charged with something unspoken. When I left that afternoon, I wasn't only thinking about the suit. I was thinking about the way her eyes had softened, the way her voice had trembled, and the way her touch had lingered like a secret I wasn't sure I was meant to carry. I told myself I was only returning to check the progress of the suit. That was true, in part. But if I was being honest, there was another reason I walked back into that little shop so soon. I wanted to see her again. The bell above the door chimed softly as I stepped inside. She looked up from the counter where she was sketching a pattern, and her lips curved into that warm, effortless smile that somehow made the shop brighter than the sunlight spilling in. "You're early," she said, tilting her head with a trace of amusement. I shrugged, trying to sound casual. "I figured you might need me for adjustments." She raised a brow as if she saw through my excuse, but said nothing. Instead, she motioned me toward the mirror once more. The routine felt familiar now, jacket off, standing tall, her circling me with tape and pins. And yet it didn't feel routine at all. Everything felt sharper. More deliberate. This time, she lingered. Her fingers smoothed the fabric across my shoulders, pressing lightly against the muscle beneath as though testing both the fit and the man wearing it. She stepped back, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied the lines. "Better," she murmured, half to herself. "You're holding yourself straighter." I almost laughed, but the way she was looking at me stopped me. Her gaze wasn't critical, nor detached, it was searching. As if she was measuring something no tape could capture. She leaned in again, brushing a stray thread from my chest. Her knuckles grazed against me, so lightly it might have been accidental. Still, the warmth of that fleeting touch seemed to burn through the cotton of my shirt. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was heavy with awareness, the kind that makes every breath feel louder, every heartbeat more pronounced. I could hear the faint ticking of the old clock on the wall, the scratch of her pencil as she noted something on the pad, the soft swish of her skirt as she moved. At one point, her hair slipped loose from its bun, falling across her cheek. Instinctively, I wanted to reach out and brush it away, but I held still, afraid of breaking the fragile balance between us. She tucked it back with a small, almost shy gesture, a rare glimpse of vulnerability that only deepened the pull I felt toward her. When she finally stepped back, her eyes met mine in the mirror. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Something passed between us, quiet, unspoken, but undeniable. She broke the moment with a professional nod. "It's coming together well," she said softly, her tone carefully measured. But the faint curve of her lips betrayed a deeper warmth. As I left that day, carrying nothing more than the promise of a finished suit, I realized the shop had become more than a place of tailoring. It had become a place where every glance, every brush of her hand, every silence stretched longer than it should, and meant more than either of us dared to admit. It was during the third fitting that something shifted. She was pinning the sleeve of the jacket, standing close enough that I could feel the brush of her arm against mine as she worked. Her focus was steady, her lips pressed into a line of concentration. But then, all at once, her hands paused. She kept them there, hovering just above my arm, as if she'd forgotten what she was doing. I glanced down at her, and that's when I noticed it, the faint tremble in her fingers, the way her breath caught ever so slightly. Her eyes lifted to mine, uncertain, almost searching. And then, in a voice so quiet I almost thought I'd imagined it, she whispered, "It's strange, working on clothes for someone who reminds me so much of the man I used to dream of." The words hung between us, fragile and dangerous. She blinked quickly, as though realizing too late what she had said. "Forgive me," she added, trying to laugh it off, her cheeks flushing with color. "I shouldn't have said that. It was foolish." But it wasn't foolish. Not to me. I didn't speak right away. Instead, I reached out instinctively, gently placing my hand over hers. Her skin was warm beneath my palm, but I felt the faint tremor that betrayed her composure. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The shop was silent except for the ticking clock on the wall and the faint rustle of fabric. When I finally spoke, my voice was low, careful. "It's not foolish. You don't have to hide what you feel." She shook her head, pulling her hand back only slightly, though she didn't let go completely. "You're young," she murmured, her eyes fixed on the floor. "And I'm not supposed to think these things." There was pain in her voice, the kind that comes from years of holding herself back, of living carefully within the lines that life had drawn for her. I wanted to tell her that I understood. That it didn't matter. That the way I felt around her, the warmth, the pull, the quiet steadiness, wasn't bound by years or expectations. But instead of spilling everything, I squeezed her hand gently, grounding her in that moment. "You're allowed to feel," I said softly. "You're allowed to want." Her breath shuddered as she looked back at me, her eyes shimmering with something raw longing, regret, hope, maybe all at once. She didn't reply, but she didn't need to. The silence between us was no longer empty. It was full, heavy with everything we couldn't yet say. At last, she pulled her hand free, smoothing the fabric of my sleeve as though returning to her work. Her composure slipped back into place, but the moment had already happened. It couldn't be undone. When I left that evening, the suit was still unfinished. But something else had begun to take shape, something more delicate, more dangerous, and infinitely more real than the stitches she wove into fabric. The evening stretched longer than I had expected. I had stopped by the shop just to check on the progress, but somehow, between adjusting hems and marking seams, the hours slipped away. Outside, the sky turned amber, then purple, until only the soft glow of the street lamps filtered through the window. Inside, it was just the two of us. The shop felt smaller at night, quieter, more intimate. The rolls of fabric along the walls seemed to fade into shadow, leaving only the warm circle of lamplight around us. She gathered the last of her tools, tidying the table where she had worked. "Thank you for your patience," she murmured, her voice carrying the weariness of the day but also a gentle warmth. "Thank you," I replied, stepping closer to help. I picked up stray pins and folded bits of cloth, wanting to ease her burden, but also wanting a reason to stay near her. Our hands brushed as we reached for the same spool of thread. The touch was accidental, fleeting, but neither of us pulled away right away. My fingers tingled, and when I looked up, I found her watching me. The moment hung there, delicate and unsteady. She was close enough that I could see the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the small details that spoke of years lived fully. Her hair had loosened again, a dark strand falling across her cheek, and without thinking, I reached out. My fingers brushed lightly against her skin as I tucked the strand back behind her ear. Her breath caught. She didn't move. Her eyes softened, searching mine as if trying to read what I wasn't saying aloud. The air thickened, filled with the rhythm of our breaths, the faint hum of the lamp. We leaned toward each other, slowly, like two people caught in a gravity they didn't fully understand but couldn't resist. My heart hammered in my chest, louder than the quiet ticking of the wall clock. Her lips parted slightly. The space between us shrank until I could feel the warmth of her breath against my mouth. For a heartbeat, it felt inevitable, the moment when silence would finally break into something more. But then, she pulled back. It was gentle, not abrupt. She placed her hand lightly on my chest, a barrier that was tender rather than cold. Her eyes held mine, steady but filled with something unspoken. A small smile touched her lips, soft, wistful, almost apologetic. "Not yet," she whispered. Her words weren't rejection. They were protection for me, for her, for the fragile thing we were both trying to pretend we weren't building. I nodded slowly, my throat tight, though I said nothing. She lowered her hand, letting it linger against me for a second longer before stepping away. The moment had passed, but it hadn't vanished. It lived in the charged silence, in the memory of almost, in the quiet ache that followed. And when I finally stepped out into the night, the cool air did nothing to steady the fire that still burned inside me. When I returned to the shop for the final time, it felt different. The anticipation I carried with me wasn't just about picking up a finished suit, it was about seeing her again, about whatever might linger between us after everything we had shared in those quiet hours together. The bell chimed as I stepped inside. She looked up from the counter, and though her smile was as professional as ever, I could see the softness in her eyes. It was a smile meant only for me, even if she'd never admit it aloud. "Your suit is ready," she said simply, reaching beneath the counter to retrieve a carefully wrapped package. The brown paper was tied neatly with twine, her work as precise in the wrapping as it had been in every stitch. She placed it in my hands, and for a moment, I just stood there, reluctant to take it because I knew that once I did, I'd have no reason to stay. "Thank you," I said, my voice lower than usual. "For the suit, and for everything else." Her expression flickered, surprise, perhaps, or maybe the same quiet ache I felt inside. She came around the counter, standing close, her presence filling the small space between us. Before I could say anything more, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around me. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't casual. It was deliberate, gentle, and unspoken in its meaning. Her arms slipped around my shoulders, pulling me into her, and I felt the soft weight of her cheek rest against my chest. For a moment, the world outside the shop didn't exist. There was only the steady thud of her heartbeat pressed close to mine, and the warmth of her holding me as though she didn't want to let go. I closed my eyes and breathed her in, the faint lavender of her perfume, the clean scent of fabric, the warmth that was entirely hers. My hands found her back carefully, not pulling too tightly, but enough to tell her I didn't want to leave either. We stayed like that longer than I expected. Not speaking. Not moving. Just being. When she finally drew back, her eyes shimmered, though her smile held steady. "Take care of yourself," she whispered. "And stand tall. Let the suit remind you of who you're becoming." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. The package felt heavier in my arms now, not because of its weight, but because of everything it represented: the hours, the silences, the almost confessions, the almost kiss. As I stepped out into the sunlight, I glanced back once more. She was standing in the doorway, watching me with that same soft expression. And I knew, without a doubt, that whatever this was, fragile, unfinished, unspoken, it was real. Some things don't need to be declared. Some bonds are stitched quietly, thread by thread, until they become part of who you are. And that's what she had done. She hadn't just measured me for a suit. She had measured me for something far greater, a connection I would carry with me, always.